Good evening. Welcome to our program tonight. I'm Ann Toback, the CEO of the Workers' Circle. Welcome to Beyond the Almost Promised Land, a program exploring Hasia Diner's seminal work of scholarship on Jewish involvement in the early civil rights movement. In the Almost Promised Land, American Jews and Blacks, 1915 to 1935. The Workers' Circle is a Jewish social justice organization that builds progressive Jewish identity through cultural engagement, the promotion of Yiddish language and traditions, and multi-generational education, all with the goal of inspiring collective engagement and impactful activism. We know that we have a responsibility to understand and work against racism as part of our work learning and engaging around the Yiddish culture, which forms such a crucial part of our heritage and values. This program is one part of our commitment to fighting racism. We also take action to advance racial equity through ongoing activism on voting rights, immigrant rights, and worker rights. We're thrilled to have 13 co-sponsors of this two-part program, and you can see them now in the chat. We value this opportunity to work as partners to fight racism and create a Shenera and Besser Welt for Allah, a better and more beautiful world for all, with all of these partners. This evening, Yiddish performer Anthony Mordechai Zvi Russell will be interviewing Hasia Diner, the Paul and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History at New York University and a board member of the Workers' Circle. Tonight, we will not be taking questions from the audience. Rather, Anthony will stand in for us as the reader of the book and as interlocutor with Hasia. This magisterial book raises profound questions and tells a nuanced history of Black and Jewish relations. Anthony read this book and is posing questions as a Jew and as a Black man, as someone who holds both identities, and he brings his own experience of being Black in America to his reading of this book that is about American Jewish interaction with the Black experience. I'm honored to introduce Hasia Diner, the Paul and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History at New York University, director of the Goldstein-Gorin Center for American Jewish History, and a Guggenheim Fellow. She is also an elected member of both the Society of American Historians and the American Academy of Jewish Research. Professor Diner is the author of We Remember with Reverence and Love, American Jews and the Myth of Silence After the Holocaust, winner of a National Jewish Book Award and the American Jewish Historical Society's Saul Wiener Prize, and Roads Taken, the Great Jewish Migration to the New World and the Peddlers Who Led the Way, a global history of Jewish peddling and Jewish migrations. She has built her scholarly career around many subjects, including the study of American Jewish history, immigrant groups, and the contours of their migration and settlement in the United States. I'm also delighted to introduce Anthony Mordechai Zvi Russell, a vocalist, performer, and arranger specializing in music in the Yiddish language, as well as an essayist in a number of publications, including Jewish Currents and Moment magazine. Anthony has been consulting with the Workers' Circle around the subjects of racial justice and Yiddishkeit since the fall of 2020. Anthony lives in Massachusetts with his husband of 5 years, Rabbi Michael Rothbaum. Welcome, Hasia and Anthony. And Anthony, now I turn this program over to you.
Thank you so much, Anne. Last week's interview was a look at various aspects, personal, social, and academic, that went into the development of Professor Diner's book, In the Almost Promised Land, American Jews and Blacks, 1915 to 1935. Tonight's interview will be about the book itself, its exploration of 2 decades of Jewish advocacy on behalf of a Black community beleaguered by structural, systemic, and violent racism, the cultural and societal motivations behind that advocacy, and the implications of that history for us today. I'd now like to give a general overview for the audience of the book before we dive into its contents. The book starts with a general accounting of the respective status of Blacks and Jews in American society at the beginning of the 20th century, after which it moves on to the phenomenon of consistent coverage of Black people, their lives, and the issues that affected them in both the Yiddish language and English language Jewish press. From there, the book moves on to survey the considerable involvement of Jews in the establishment and maintenance of the NAACP in its earliest days, and the academic works of Jews in social sciences in discrediting a scientific basis for racism. We then read of the rise of American Jewish philanthropy on behalf of Black causes as various as education, housing, healthcare, and social sciences, and the personal interactions of Jewish philanthropy with contemporary Black intelligentsia and leadership of the time. In a section that is bound to be of particular interest to our audience here, the Jewish labor movement and its efforts to organize the Black American worker is covered, a section which, spoiler alert, the Workers' Circle and their allyship with organized Black labor is mentioned. We'll be getting to that shortly. And finally, the book ends with a conclusion exploring the reasons as to why the circumstances under which all this attention and advocacy happened becomes less compelling over time to the respective communities involved. Hasia, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'd like to take a look at the subtitle of the book, American Jews and Blacks, 1915 to 1935, and why you chose these particular years on which to focus your work. As you mentioned in the book, Jewish advocacy for Black causes both pre- and post-dates this particular period. So what happened in 1915 to 1935 that makes that span of years the focus of this book?
Obviously, a fantastic introduction, and I really appreciate it, and a good question. So there is no doubt that I could have started a bit earlier. I could have gone later, but one of the issues is always the amount of time one has at one's command. But I think more importantly, 1915 jumped out at me as a year because it was in this year that American Jews witnessed the lynching of Leo Frank, a Jewish man who lived in Atlanta. He was a manager of a factory and accused of a crime against a young white Christian girl. And he was found guilty and lynched. Now, there was absolutely no evidence against him. It was a lynching, first a legal lynching and then a literal lynching. But I think that this event really highlighted or pushed Jews to thinking about this whole issue of the status of Black people, where lynching was a commonplace event, unlike this one event, which tragically involved this one Jew. It was something, and the Yiddish press reported on this a lot. Year by year, the numbers just kept rolling in of Black people who were subjected to this heinous crime. And so it seemed like a very logical place to start because it drew attention to this matter. The end date seemed to me reasonable on two grounds. And so first, it was in 1935, in that mid-1930s, where American Jewish attention certainly shifted in large measure to the unfolding crisis in Germany. It was the year of the Nuremberg laws. And not that they dropped at all their interest in Black people, but that begins, one might say, a new chapter. And it was a new chapter also because between 1935, and again, I could have gone back to 1909 and the founding of the NAACP, until the mid-1930s, much of what Jews did vis-a-vis Black Americans, be it in philanthropy or civil rights, even some of the labor organizing, tended to be the actions of individuals, okay, and not the organizations behind which they stood, or in some cases, the organizations they actually ran. It was individuals, not the, shall we call it, the organized Jewish community. The unfolding crisis in Germany pushed American Jewish organizations to redirect how they participated in the public sphere. And in a sense, as organizations became even more bold in linking their name, okay, and their organizational resources to what they saw as a twinned project of defense of Jews and structuring the American legal and political system.
All right. I think we're going to be revisiting that phenomenon of advocacy and philanthropy happening in terms of the individual as opposed to the organizational later in this conversation, because it feels like a real phenomenon in comparison to the way in which these issues are advocated on behalf of and later in the century. I'd like to start, as you do, with a look at the Jewish press, both in Yiddish and English. In the book, you write, quote, "Because they articulated social goals for their newspapers, the editors and writers of the Yiddish press emerged as distinct leaders of the immigrant Jewish community," end quote. In spite of the political differences between them, Yiddish language papers approached the subject of Black Americans with what you call a certain uniformity. The English language Jewish press, like the Yiddish press, quote, used the images of Black life as vehicles for self-examination and evaluation. What effect do you think the status of Black people in the American Jewish press had on interactions between Black people and Jews, or attitudes of these two groups towards each other?
So that's in some ways one of the most difficult questions to ever ask, because we know we can say the American Jewish reading public, whether readers of Yiddish newspapers or readers of these various English publications, were fed a steady diet of articles, editorials, sometimes editorial cartoons that drove home a set of related points. Black people are being treated inhumanely in the United States. Theirs is a tragic situation. There are deep and profound parallels between what they're experiencing and both what we have experienced in the past and what we're experiencing now in Europe in the 19-teens, 1920s, and the 1930s. So they're fed this diet. This is what they're reading. Now, what did people do with what they read? We can't know. Okay, we can know only that the articles didn't dwindle in number. And so presumably there was no angry public telling through letters to the editor or other kinds of ways in which readers can influence the press. There clearly is nobody saying, don't write these kinds of things. Okay, so we'll have to take the lack of silence as an indication that there's no negative reaction to it. These papers, particularly the Yiddish magazines, are full of advertisements. Okay, so advertisers or businesses are putting their advertising dollars in publications that are excoriating the United States for its behavior. So that doesn't seem to dwindle either. So we can know the articles were there, they weren't challenged in any significant way or in any way that we can prove. What people did with it, that sadly we cannot know. And only if people were writing letters to the editor saying, don't ever publish this again, we don't get that. And so I'm going to have to assume, although I don't even try to do that, that if people read these articles in publications they subscribed to or that they picked up, it didn't bother them. Okay, now that's the most I can say. And it is really too bad because we don't have Yelp or any of the kinds of crowdsourcing where we can find out more about how people are responding to what's in print.
Right, there isn't an internet feedback loop, which we can
Right.
sort of log on to and figure out what people's reactions
Right.
were to these.
You
these
can't, they
writings.
couldn't like the articles.
Right. I was wondering if you could give us an impression of how crucial the language and rhetoric one found in the American Jewish press was in creating empathy in its readers towards the plight of American Black people.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the rhetoric, the language, the choices of words, the choices of images were incredibly profound. And it's very hard to imagine somebody reading this and not immediately grabbing, seeing, sensing the passion and the intensity. And the fact that these articles consistently linked Jews as non-participants in the oppression of Black people, okay, as those who didn't participate in lynching and so on, and that these newspapers used language drawn from the Jewish experience, and so a lynching or a race massacre like the one that occurred in Tulsa in 1921 were called pogroms. They weren't called race riots, written out in Yiddish characters. They were pogroms, and the people who perpetrated this were often called Cossacks. Okay, and sometimes the place where a lynching took place was referred to as the auto da fe. Okay, the site in Spain where the Inquisition tortured its victims. Sometimes the lynchers were the Black Hundred. So this was a kind of crack unit within the Tsarist army that was involved with some of the pogroms. So this language just melded the Jewish and the Black experience and kept highlighting the fact that Jews felt the empathy in a way that other white Americans did not.
It's fascinating just thinking about the idea of Black experience happening, um, being illustrated by Jewish vocabulary and Jewish experience, Jewish history at this point. In the book, as you go on to outline Jewish contributions to the establishment and progression of the NAACP, I was struck by the formation of a kind of American liberal consensus around the issue of advancing the rights of Black people. In
Mhm.
this particular case, leadership coming from different places, such as New England liberal, historically abolitionist circles, Black intelligentsia, and an assemblage of prominent German and Austrian Jews descended from earlier waves of Jewish immigration. As you say, quote, professionals, lawyers, rabbis, social workers, academicians, and businessmen making up the most visible elite of American Jewry, end quote. So these were people who lent their various professional areas of expertise, influence, and resources to the cause of civil rights. By this point in the book, it really began to occur to me how much this is a history of specifically how Jewish leadership impacted the lives of Black people in America during this period. And I think I found this fascinating because common narratives about Jewish involvement in the mid-century civil rights movement, decades after the period covered in this conversation, are often expressed anecdotally, either in very general terms, the Jews did this during the civil rights movement, or in extremely personal terms. I held meetings, I marched, I organized because this was important to me as a Jew. Oftentimes Abraham Joshua Heschel is mentioned, but the sense of an organized Jewish leadership, as opposed to an almost grassroots movement, often gets lost in the telling of mid-century Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement. In the period you covered in the book, what was the relationship between Jewish leadership, like Rabbi Stephen Wise, Lillian Wald, Arthur, and Joel Spingarn? What was the relationship between this kind of Jewish leadership and your regular Jew on the street?
Okay. So I perhaps I'm covering my covering myself. I did not set out to write about the ordinary Jew on the street, and that to me is one of the shortcomings of the book. I think that the book really needed that kind of Jew on the street perspective. It would have been a very different book, and that's not what I did. But this was a book about the leadership, and even the union leaders are still leaders. They're still an elite, and so So what was their relationship to the Jew on the street? It really varied from person to person. Louis Marshall, who plays a pretty oversized role in this book, is the president of the American Jewish Committee. And one might say he may have been the most influential Jew in 20th century America. He was just a powerful leader. Now, he didn't actually come from terribly elite background himself, but he certainly traveled in those circles, and he interacted with those people. He didn't have a whole lot of connection to the ordinary Jew who might own a dry goods store on the corner, or who was a factory worker, but we know that they admired him, and that even those individuals who show up in this book, who were kind of anathema to many, for example, of the socialists who were editing the foreword, but when they wrote about, for example, Julius Rosenwald's philanthropy towards Black people, they forgave Rosenwald all of his other sins and held him up as an exemplar. Now, did he have any relationship with them? Very small, okay, if at all. I didn't make any effort, as it were. It's a great question, and that's not the question I asked. Again, one finds no criticism of this leadership group for doing what they did. And I think there is a story to be told about the grassroots, and again, you call it the Jew on the street. I think there's a book to be written about the reality of their interactions with Black people at this time and beyond.
So you brought up Julius Rosenwald, and he sort of exists in this web of Jewish philanthropy rather prominently. I found him a very interesting person as a major financial backer of the NAACP, and one of the most prominent American philanthropists devoted to the cause of Black education. 10 to 12% of the schools that Rosenwald gave to Black communities in roughly the first 3 decades of the 20th century are still up and running. What I found interesting in your analysis of him was that he supported organizational efforts from both Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, who, if the audience doesn't know, were 2 Black leaders of very different opinions as to how Blacks should go about the business of seeking equality in the United States. Julius Rosenwald supported both of them, and if I'm not mistaken, he wasn't the only Jewish philanthropist who did this. In my personal observation, usually a member of contemporary Jewish leadership finds one prominent Black person whose views hew rather closely to their own, and they support them to the exclusion of others. So I found this older model of support really interesting. What do you think was the strategy behind supporting 2 somewhat adversarial approaches by Black leaders at the same time like this?
So, just first, how actually adversarial they were, I think has been overstated. And
it's funny because I was trying to check this, and I put in, literally put into Google, Du Bois and V, and it said versus Booker T. Washington. So there's already a narrative about kind of their particular philosophies almost being kind of not against each other, but really being on the opposite sides, perhaps.
Right. So so instead of saying opposite, one might say that they both identified the same problem. But the question was how to attack that problem.
Right.
How to where to try to penetrate what was this kind of massive edifice of discrimination and kind of horror with which Black people lived. And so that for Du Bois, it was primarily through the push for civil rights as a kind of legal strategy, and also the development of a kind of intellectual elite, and to engage in the kinds of activities which would push the state to act in different ways. For Washington, it was before we can do that. It's not that he was against it, but before we can do that, our people have to be educated. They have to learn to read and write. That literacy was connected to economic development. And at one point, he actually says a man who can't sign his name and can't read a contract is going to be exploited. Okay, so it's not that he was for the continuing legal disabilities. Now, Rosenwald, interestingly, saw something in both messages. And so on the one hand, yes, the lion's share of his money towards Black causes went to the schools project, and it was massive. And one statistic had that by 1930, 90% of all Black children in Mississippi went to a Rosenwald school. So it's a pretty remarkable statistic. And that the difference, by the way, between literacy rates of Black soldiers in World War I and World War II was massive. And it's attributed to the fact that by World War II, many of these young men had gone through Rosenwald schools and were no longer illiterate, as their forebears had been in the earlier war before the school project got on. But Rosenwald was also was involved in a major campaign to support Black intellectuals, scientists, sociologists, writers, artists, musicians. And so the Rosenwald grants, which only went to Black people, and there were whites who wrote to Rosenwald, and their letters survived saying, well, could I apply? And they said, no, this is, white people have other places they can go for support. This is for Black people. And you could probably not name, the program ends, the Rosenwald Fund came to an end in the mid-1940s. It was slated to end 25 years after Rosenwald's death in 25. The endowment spent its money down. But what you could say between when he starts doing this in 1917 and when it ends, 25 years after his death, there is probably not a single Black intellectual, scientist, artist, writer who did not have a Rosenwald grant, including Du Bois. Now that's not a Washington type project. Okay. But that was not alien to Rosenwald's idea of what you do with your money. I mean, it's, again, really interesting that in the first couple of years when the NAACP was really foundering in terms of finances, he kind of steps in and pretty much bails it out. He didn't really hear the ideological difference. Now, again, I think that maybe historians have overstated the ideological differences, but he surely didn't hear them. And I can offer a kind of analogy, which is he also funds the Jewish Theological Seminary and the Hebrew Union College, two very different institutions. And at one point he said, why don't they just merge? Okay, and let's also throw in the Jewish Institute of Religion, which was a new seminary founded by Stephen Wise. He said he called them rabbi factories. He said, let there only be one, and they don't have to duplicate, the faculty and the buildings and the curricula and so on. Now, he couldn't even understand. He was tone deaf to the tremendous differences between what JTS was trying to do and the Hebrew Union College. Okay, to him, they were all just training rabbis. So he actually made a very big point of saying, I barely finished the 6th grade. And so I can't get mired down in all these intellectual sort of complexities. I give where it feels right. And he had his particular criteria of what he gave to. And he's willing to give to Du Bois, he's willing to give to Washington, and then Washington's successors. And whatever came across his desk, if it fit this particular criteria, he gave to it.
So I think what I'm realizing now as you tell me this is that it wasn't so much that he, was deliberately saying, oh, now I want to support Du Bois, oh, now I want to support Booker T. Washington, but that the diversity of interest he had in funding encompassed both the work of Du Bois and Booker T. Washington.
Absolutely, at the same time, so they're simultaneous. Now, obviously, Du Bois lived so much longer than Washington, but Washington's follower, his successors, Rosenwald was out there funding them too, and often they came up with what might have seemed to be totally impractical projects, but he just really liked it. So there was one of Emmett Scott, who had been Washington's secretary, wanted to produce a movie that would be a response to Birth of a Nation. And it was really called The Birth of a Race. And it was kind of a total fiasco. And it never got made. But whose money paid for this ill-fated film? It was Julius Rosenwald. So what a great idea to, sort of counter Birth of a Nation with a story about, it was actually to be based on Booker Washington's autobiography Up from Slavery. And never
It
got
sounds
made.
very contemporary in the sense
Yeah.
that, like, as opposed to writing a number of letters to a publication expecting everyone to read them, he was actually just going to directly fund a movie that would
Yeah.
counter the movie that came before. That's fascinating. In your chapter on Jewish labor and the organization of the Black worker, you write, quote, "In the garment factories of New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, Jewish and Black workers labored side by side. They belonged to the same unions and aided each other in the quest for economic security." You go on to say in the chapter that Jewish union leaders had three crucial identities at play in the years before 1935: that of being union leaders, being socialists, and being Jews, and that the pivotal element of these three identities motivating assistance of Black workers was their Jewishness. Can you kind of unpack that idea for us?
Okay, so most labor unions did not organize Black workers. It's really not until, in fact, after 1935 and the founding of the CIO that some of the big unions really do take on campaigns to organize Black workers. But throughout much of the late 19th and into the early 20th century, many unions actually had discriminatory clauses in their union charters. The membership in the carpenters, the bricklayers, the joint for white men. I mean, it wasn't hidden; it was just there. And some of these unions actually had a pretty strong socialist orientation, but that did not stand in contradiction, as they saw it, okay, to this idea of exclusion, because they believed what they were doing was uh, organizing for the conditions of work, the wages of white workers. Okay, and bringing in Black workers was going to only lower the pay rates. Okay, and that is, if Black workers came in, everybody would sink. Okay, because the employer is not going to pay Black workers as much as he pays the white workers. And so then white workers have no leg to stand on when they start demanding. Okay, now it is really striking how the ILG and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, but particularly the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which was the union that sold women's clothing, and hence Ladies Garment Workers Union, although there were many men ran the union, and there were certainly many male workers and male union members. They took a different tack, which is we have to organize everybody, because if there are workers in our factories who aren't going to become part of the union, then the employer is going to sabotage everybody, okay, and undermine everybody's effort at gaining a decent wage, good conditions, and so on. So these unions really went out of their way to not only organize Black workers, they tend to be primarily in this period Black women, but also to highlight how much they were doing for them. And so the ILG had a newspaper called Justice, and it was first in Yiddish, and then it was Yiddish English, and then just English. But it was full of pictures of Black women and some Black men in the work site, next to white workers who are Jewish, smiling, and pictures of them at the resort. They ran a resort in the Poconos called Unity House. And there'd be pictures, at the end of the summer of, here is Julia, a worker from Barbados, and she had 2 great weeks at Unity House, swimming, going to concerts with her, all of the other workers. So it's like right there on the cover of the Union magazine. So this is a way in which it's trying to, in a way, indicate to the rest of the union membership that blacks are part of our union. Okay, they have the same interests. Okay, and these are Jewish workers and Jewish leaders.
So in what way did the Jewishness of the workers or Jewishness of the leaders, like how did that inflect this effort to both attract and retain black workers in labor organizing?
Mm-hmm. So partly it's a matter, I would say, of excluding the other analytic possibilities or the other explanations. It can't have been their unionness because most unions wouldn't allow in black workers. And it couldn't have been purely the socialists because socialists were not terribly keen on reaching out to the black population. The communists, yes, but the socialists, not really. So the one factor that's left is that as Jewish workers, they saw this in a way analogous to how those writers for the Yiddish press viewed the racial situation in America. Is we have a stake in this. I mean, the other sort of detail that's really interesting is that when A. Philip Randolph began to organize the sleeping car porters, this is one black union, and Randolph was really an incredibly important figure. So in the newspaper for the sleeping car porters, in their publication, every issue there are greetings, from To Our Brothers in Struggle, okay, from David Dubinsky, from Sidney Hillman, from the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, from International Ladies Garment Workers, Local 22. Your Jewish brothers share with you in your struggle. So they are uploading this. They're putting this really in front of their outreach to, in this case, to Randolph. And so I can say there weren't very many ads from other unions in Randolph's publication. Okay, I mean, it's just they weren't there. The Jewish ones said, from your Jewish working brothers.
It's amazing. Something I was delighted to encounter was documented actions on the part of the Arbiter Ring, which we now call, of course, the Workers' Circle, expressing their stance on anti-black racism by refusing to become chartered in several southern states because the
Mm-hmm.
incorporation papers stated that membership must be limited to whites. You
Mm-hmm.
write that it was not that they wanted or even expected blacks to join the Arbiter Ring, but they did not want to sanction racism in even the most minor way. These expressions of solidarity become even more pronounced with the rise of the aforementioned black socialist A. Philip Randolph and his
Mm-hmm.
efforts to unionize Pullman railway porters as the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Workers. His work was not only celebrated, but also supported by the institutions of Jewish labor, Workers' Circle financially supporting not
Mm-hmm.
only the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Workers, um, but also Randolph's publication, The Messenger, which was a consciousness-raising publication for the black worker. The leadership of the Workers' Circle invited Randolph to speak at their conventions numerous times in the 1920s, where he was often one of the few non-Yiddish speaking presenters to address the convention. At the very same time, we have considerable efforts of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union in outreach and support of the working black community, with the legendary Rosh Schneiderman insisting that the Local 62 change their meetings from Yiddish to English so they would be more inclusive to black workers. This was part and parcel to a general philosophy that the virtues of organizing should be available to people of all ethnic backgrounds, as is displayed by efforts to engage the Irish and Italian worker as well. Besides looking more like the grassroots organizing we're familiar with in social justice movements today, what were the definitive differences between advocacy of Jewish labor on behalf of the Black worker and the philanthropists and influential models represented by other kinds of Jewish leadership? Like, were the motivations different behind Jewish labor's support of the Black worker than other efforts that were going on at the time?
Okay, so I mean, on the one hand, in those unions, let's say those weeks at Unity House where African American workers are getting their week in the country, uh, um, they are sharing kind of recreational space. Now, that was not very common in American society, and in the factories where they worked in the same shop. Okay, there's a kind of proximity, uh, sitting at the lunch table, sharing a pair of scissors, chatting about whatever workers, male or female, might be chatting about while they're working. You know, most of the other people, like Louis Marshall and so on, had very few opportunities to do that, or their world was their white upper middle class, or for the case of Rosenwald, upper class Jewish world. And yes, I mean he spent time with these with people like Washington and the others, but there was the grassroots ones, which we see in the labor movement, uh, evinced a kind of intimacy, a kind of you are a worker just like I am. It's not a top down. Okay, I'm not really giving you anything. We are both going out on the picket line together. Okay, now, just so we don't get too romantic about this, in later decades, particularly in the 1950s and 1960s, where the white Jewish male leadership wants to hold on to its positions with a vengeance, they come smack dab. They stumble into the next phase of the civil rights era, where Black workers and Puerto Rican workers, who are now the majority in the garment shops, okay, begin to say, wait a minute, how come you guys are still the president? And how come you're on the executive council and we're not? Okay, so there's a clash, but that is going to be decades in the making. And in the period about which I was writing, the Black, again, particularly women who are in the garment shops, are relatively recent migrants from many, by the way, from the West Indies, but others from the rural South. And these are women who have already had some exposure to sewing. Obviously, they had some exposure to sewing. It's a relatively unskilled job. And so they come in, but we're catching them in a way in this book at the beginning of their entry into the garment industry, okay, into the garment factories. Okay, later on, the Jews are going to exit, the Italians are going to exit, okay, and the Blacks and Puerto Ricans will become the backbone of the labor force. And they are not happy with deferring to these white Jewish men who'd been hanging around since the 1920s.
Right. Now, at the end of almost every chapter, you briefly explore the relationship between the sense American Jews had of their own Jewishness and how that sense of Jewishness inflected the kinds of advocacy covered in each chapter. When I say Jewishness, I mean it in a maximalist sense, the American Jewish sense of their own history, their text, their religion, their culture, their place in Western society, and their position in American society. In American Jewish spaces, it's very easy to encounter, anecdotally, the contention that Jews took their place in American social justice movements simply because they were Jews. Rabbis will quote the prophets. Amateur Jewish genealogists will track personal histories of flight and persecution. The politically engaged progressive Jew will be inspired by a history of struggle against domination that started on another shore in another century. I'd like to hear from you in all its varied and complicated glory. What are the reasons Jews figure so prominently in this early history of the American civil rights movement?
Right. Okay. Again, a fabulous question. And I just want to extend it beyond civil rights, but also I think we can throw into the hopper the philanthropy and the labor organizing, because these are not exactly civil rights, but they're certainly not far from it. So I'm going to offer three explanations. And, if the time allows, I have some little quotes I wanted to share. But I think it served, three purposes for these individuals, okay, whose stories I tell in the pages in this book. And although they themselves didn't ever give these as answers, but we have to extrapolate this from what they did and kind of allied statements they made. But first, it was their way to prove that they not only had a place in America, they were not only Americans, but they were actually better Americans than those people who were claiming that Jews would never be Americans. That is, this is taking place during the period over the struggle for immigration restriction, a kind of high point of American anti-Semitism, when so many voices are saying the Jews have their loyalties elsewhere, the Jews only think about themselves, the Jews can never really represent this country, they're outsiders. And so in the articles, let's say in the Yiddish and in the English language magazines, which are in some ways the most eloquent for us, when they when they write articles about, let's say, lynchings or race riots, and race riot, I, by the way, believe is a misnomer, because these are basically massacres, in Chicago and Elaine, Arkansas, and East St. Louis, and so on. If and when those took place on the 4th of July or Memorial Day, these editorials, I actually kept reading the same editorial once in 1916, then again in 1918. Since I was sitting there reading it on microfilm, I could see this is the same article that had been there before. But they said, look, here are these Americans who claim that they created this nation, but on their holiest holiday, they think nothing of killing innocent human beings, Black people whose only crime is being not white. Okay, but by claiming that what the white racists did was a stain on the American flag, the Jews are kind of wrapping themselves in the American flag. Okay, I think another part of this story, which I think again keeps resonating, is that by singling themselves out, by saying, look what we Jews are doing, look how good we Jews are, look how our tradition helps us be good, look at how our history of suffering has ennobled us because we take up the cause of because we feel the plight of the Black person, then they are showing how important Judaism, however they define it, is in the service of an American cause. In other words, Judaism isn't something to be cast aside in the quest to be cut for Jewish integration. Judaism is going to serve us. And it's going to serve us because we will be better people and therefore better Americans. Okay, and thirdly, I think this became a very strategic place, and it was something you alluded to before, for these Jews, at a period of time where anti-Semitism is pretty rampant. It's a chance for them to meet with and engage with well-off white elite Americans, people of the old abolitionist background, whose parents or grandparents had been abolitionists, who were kind of so clearly American insiders that Jews could meet these white Americans on a common ground. And it's a common ground in service of Black people. And in fact, the Jews on this common ground can almost place themselves above, okay, the white elites by essentially saying, we're doing even more of this than you are. Okay, so it served a kind of strategic purpose for them in their quest for integration. as they interacted with these American elites, but it also helped them prove the importance of Judaism. And I'll just throw out one little anecdote, which I couldn't put it in the book because it was written about 7 years after my book ends. It was in 1942. The Society for the Advancement of Judaism, the mother church, as it were, of the Reconstructionist movement, premiered a cantata which was entitled "What is Torah?" And it was premiered on Shavuot, 1942. And in this cantata, the narrator or the chorus asks, "What is Torah?" And it's a mother crooning over her babe. It's a Kabbalistic prayer. It's somebody running from an angry mob. And then the chorus says, "What is Torah? Torah is the hope of the Negro people." And they're saying, here in America, this is the issue. This is what is the American original sin. Not that they would have used the word original sin. This is the American stain. And it's Torah, i.e., the Jewish tradition, which is the antidote to that sin. So therefore, as American Jews, particularly the American-born children of the immigrants or grandchildren, as they are entering into American life, and the question was, how much of their Judaism would they keep? How much of their Jewish identity would they keep? Would they try to hide it? Would they try to become something else? This rhetoric is saying, when you go out in the American world, just know that your Jewishness is the one of the forces that's going to liberate or that's going to free Black people from the suffering they endure. And so these three kind of kept creeping up, in indirect ways in the rhetoric, both of the individuals as they are navigating their work with the civil rights or philanthropic or labor movement. And it comes up in their publications. Jews do this, and we do this because we're good Americans, indeed better Americans. We do this because we are good Jews, and we do this because we want to show important Americans how good we are. So it's very, and I don't use the word self-serving as a negative term. Okay, that is, they got something out of it. They saw it as an important tool to use as they had to come to terms with the United States. There's no place else for them to go, and they're on the path towards integration, and they use this, okay, to help them chart what is essentially unknown terrain in their new American home.
Absolutely. Absolutely fascinating. I feel like so many of those motivations are still at work today, but they have different names and different narratives are attached to them. But I still feel like these reasons for wanting to take part in social justice are still there, they're still very much in the air. Reading in your book about support in the Jewish press of the first half of the 20th century for increased access to the ballot and protection of the rights for the Black voter, it's simultaneously so heartening and yet so dispiriting because we are still fighting for many of the very same things that almost 90 years later they were fighting for before. If anything, we're actually fighting for a restoration of gains that were made concerning voting rights during the mid-century civil rights movement. Today in Washington, D.C., the Workers' Circle took part in a direct action engaging in civil disobedience in order to get the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act signed into law. I'm curious if you think the reasons that compelled Jews to act on behalf of the rights of Black people in the years 1915 and 1935 are more or less the same ones that still compelled Jews to act today.
Certainly one can see parallels. I think the problem with seeing parallels or analogies is that, the world has changed so dramatically. what I wrote about was before the Holocaust. It was before, we're talking now primarily of American Jews. The American Jewish population is probably fourth generation since the great immigration from Europe. The level of economic achievement of Jews in the United States just is something that would have been probably unimaginable to the people who those who people this book. And I, would be really interested well, actually, and the other major change is that Black people in the United States are not the people who are in this book. I mean, we're talking about a generation of people who are, a population that's a generation out of slavery in 1915, and while in my most negative or pessimistic moods, I think, oh my God, nothing's actually, like you said, nothing has changed. I think the level of assertiveness and saying, wait a minute, we don't want charity, we don't want help. We are involved in our own liberation. Okay, if you want to come along, fine, but this is our movement, okay, not yours. Okay, and certainly there are places for collaboration and partnership, but ever since the latter part of the freedom struggle, 1966, 67, the famous speech by Stokely Carmichael when he said, "Get off the bandwagon." This is, not a population that needs somebody to speak for them. Okay, so again, I'll just give you a little Julius Rosenwald story. So in 1912, right after Woodrow Wilson was elected president, he is first Southerner elected since before the Civil War, and he's known racist. And so Booker Washington wrote to Rosenwald and said, I read in the newspaper that Wilson is going to be in Chicago. Would you mind just telling him a little about the good work we're doing at Tuskegee? So, I mean, he needs, somebody to speak for him. He knows he can't approach Woodrow Wilson. And so Rosenwald says, no, even better than that, I'll bring you up to Chicago and you, Wilson, and I can have lunch together. And Washington writes back and said, don't do that, because Wilson will never sit down with me. It will only embarrass me, okay? And it'll set the cause back. But I'm here to, you see the kind of shakiness upon which the shaky ground upon which Washington was standing at that time. I don't think that is, we are back there yet. Hopefully we won't be. But I mean, I think it's a kind of sea change in those, almost century, actually more than a century when this book begins, in terms of where Jews are, where Blacks are. Can we roll back to the 1915? Sometimes I do think so, but I'm a historian, not a prophet, and so therefore my forebodings about the future are totally imaginary.
It's interesting that you should identify yourself as a historian and not a prophet, because I'm about to ask you a question that is somewhat irresponsible to ask a historian. But it's an old question, a Talmudic question, if you will. Maiko mashmalom. What is the meaning of this? What meaning can we today, as people connected to this history by lineage, nationality, culture, and community, what meaning can we take away, or could we take away, from the history you've presented in this book?
Okay, so that's a really great one. So the people, again, who show up on these pages, their publications, could have behaved differently. They didn't have to do what they did. Okay, and I think the takeaway is that when they saw injustice, rather than saying, okay, let's just close our eyes to it, let's just let it go, just let it happen and just make sure we don't get somehow caught up in it, they, stood up. Okay, they were willing to link their fate to this incredible injustice. I mean, that's an understatement to say what it was. And I think, to me, the takeaway is something I've pretty much always believed in. You don't sit by idly where other people are suffering. Now, certainly we have lots of examples, and there are historical examples in other places and other times where Jews either actively collaborated with forces of oppression, okay, or where they again did the, see no evil, hear no evil, just let this pass over me, okay. And I think the case of South Africa is a very good example, that there were individual Jews, communists mostly, who really jumped into the struggle. But for most cases, the Jewish rabbis, the Jewish institutions were, just let this happen, just leave us alone. The people in this book didn't do that. Okay, and they said there's something wrong. We're going to step up because it's going to be good for us if we step up. And so again, maybe just one other part of the answer to your question, I know we're running late, is we say, well, what's the takeaway? And it's that there is not necessarily a contradiction between getting something out of it and doing the right thing. And it's that convergence between self-interest and serving others. And so here I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to come back at you with another phrase, and it's perhaps a bit trite, but I think it really packs a punch, which is Hillel's. If I'm not for myself, who is going to be for me? I mean, I have to defend myself. I have to protect my status in the society. Okay, so if I'm not for myself, who is for me? But if I'm only for myself, what am I?
Beautifully put. Beautifully put, especially applied to this particular history. So I have one very last question. In the introduction to the 1995 edition of your book, you write, if I could rewrite this book, if I could start the project anew, I like to think that I would write more eloquently and that I would draw upon some new exciting developments in the study of the history of culture. So if given the chance, and in view of how much has changed between when you wrote those words and now, what would you change about the book? You say in the introduction that in any case, your conclusions would be the same, and I very much believe you, but what would be different?
Right. So I do wish it would have been better written, but I hope from one book to the next, I become a better writer. I can keep improving. But I would say there are kind of two things. And first, I think to look at this leadership group and to not look at the masses was an inadequacy. And I would like to think I would have done it that way. That is, it would have been both a social, it would have been a history of this elite, but it would have devoted much more attention to looking at what you called before the Jews on the street. Okay, and I think that the tools would exist, and the sources exist. I just chose not to do that, and I wish I had. And the other, in terms of something that really changed, and I would say I was tremendously impacted by Black Lives Matter and 1619 report, which it's not that it was perfect, but it did drive home this issue of complicity and how essentially all white people benefited from the America's as a racial state. And I realized that as I wrote this, and it's something I realized in a way only in retrospect, and probably since Black Lives Matter, that I engaged in a certain amount of self-censorship. And that there were, in some of these same publications, pretty offensive anti-Black jokes and short stories. There was one writer who kept popping up in some of the English language Jewish magazines, a man by the name of Roy Octavius Cohen, who was probably worse than Joel Chandler Harris in terms of writing in kind of really demeaning dialect and so on. Um, and I chose not to include that. Now I had a rationale. Okay, the rationale was kind of intellectual,
Right.
but what I understand in retrospect, it was probably also a form of censorship because I didn't want that in there. And likewise, and in a way, it goes back to the issue of leaving out the masses. How many Jewish business, sort of shopkeepers at the same moment in time when Louis Marshall or Franz Boas or Julius Rosenwald or Lillian Wald were doing this heroic work, how many Jewish shopkeepers were specifically making a living in Black neighborhoods and profiting, enhancing their economic lives on the backs of Black poverty. Now, again, it's not like I thought about it and decided not to do it, but the fact that I didn't do it says something about where I was at this moment in time, and it's what I would do differently if I did it now.
I have to commend you for actually, knowing and being able to articulate that those were things that you would have addressed had you been able to go back, like you said, in that introduction and start the project anew. Hasia, once again, I'd like to thank you for speaking with us this evening and for all your work illustrating, enriching, and complicating our communal narratives around American Jews and social justice, a history that continues to unfold today. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Really, it's been just fabulous talking with you.
The book we've been discussing this evening is In the Almost Promised Land, American Jews and Blacks, 1915 to 1935, available from Johns Hopkins University Press. It's a fascinating read, and I cannot recommend it highly enough.